In this video, I'm going to look at and describe to you what I'm looking for in the ethical and critical thinking question assignment. I'm going to tie this back to the worksheet that you did for the ethical question that we're looking at, and also talk a little bit about the rubric that I'll be using to grade your assignment. Okay, so let's look at this. And you need to take this seriously in your answers. I'll tell you, most of the time people's answers are too short. You need to go into an explanation for all of these. Just listing things is not going to be enough. Okay, question number 1. Explain the ethical dilemma or the question and explain why it is a dilemma or an issue that must be analyzed. If you go back to our worksheet, if you go back to the first page of our worksheet, if you remember, we did the ethical question. What is the ethical question? You're going to use this for question number 1 on the questions. Now here's the next part. Why is that question important? Why are we spending time with this question? How does this question influence you? How does it influence stakeholders? How does it influence society as a whole? So answering the why is this question important to look at is key. If you look at the rubric, or how I'll be looking at the rubric, when it says explanation of the problem, one of the things that gets you up to this higher level is that you're able to explain why it is an issue. Why is it something that we need to talk about, that we need to deal with, and that we need to study? So for question number 1, that's what I'm looking for. Question number 2 is describe the different viewpoints within the dilemma or the question. Explain why each creates questions or issues that must be answered. If again you go back to the first page of the worksheet, remember we had your 2 extreme viewpoints as well as our shades of gray. So what you need to talk about here is what are the different viewpoints. But you also, again, to get higher up and do well in the rubric, why do each of these cause questions to arise? Obviously, if they're extremes, there's going to be some questions that you have to deal with those. So if the accepted viewpoint is this, what are going to be some of the issues that have to be dealt with? If this is the viewpoint that's accepted, why or what issues are going to exist because of that? And you can also deal with some of the different viewpoints within the shades of gray. So obviously there are issues in all different viewpoints. You need to discuss those issues. Number 3 is, what is your viewpoint on the issue? For question 3, I want you to be very concise. What is your viewpoint in 1 sentence? Also remember, I want you to consider the shades of gray. So there are several different options. There's not just these extreme viewpoints. We've talked about, or we will have talked about, some of the shades of gray. You may come up with, when you go through this process of thinking, different shades of gray that we did not talk about. If you have something, another option, that is wonderful. I want you to include that if you're comfortable with using that as your viewpoint. So in question 3, you're basically going to state your viewpoint in 1 sentence. Now 4, 5, and 6 is where we really get into the meat of. It's easy to have a viewpoint. It's easy to have an opinion. But to be able to understand why you have that viewpoint and why you've chosen that viewpoint and what are some of the weaknesses of that viewpoint is really where the critical thinking skills come in. So how and why do your different contexts influence your viewpoint? So how do your cultural background, your educational background, your political background, your religious background, your personal experiences, how do those influence your viewpoint? So I just don't want you to say, my age influences my viewpoint. You're going to have to discuss why. A lot of times people use my religious background is the reason I think this way. Well, what you're going to have to describe to me is, what does your religious belief say or think about this issue, and why? And how does that influence your viewpoint? So again, you have to go more in depth than just saying, my education influences my viewpoint. What specifically in your educational experiences influence your viewpoint, and why? Then you're going to go into what factual information supports your viewpoint. If you remember on our sheet, on the back here, we had factual information. We had questions we had answers to. We also may have come up with, or you may have come up with questions, which again is wonderful. What questions don't we have answers for? So how does the factual information support your viewpoint? Including, it may be that since we don't know certain things, the fact that we don't know those certain things influences your viewpoint, and you'll need to discuss those also. Next is what ethical considerations can be included as evidence to support your position. So what of those bioethical principles that we talked about support your position, and why and how do they influence your position? So again, you're going to have to explain. You cannot just say, the respect for persons is why I think the way I do. You have to go into why. Explain what the respect for persons means and how it relates directly to the issue that we're talking about. In question 7, you're going to look at the stakeholders, their context, and their bioethical principles that support your viewpoint. So, again, you look at the back page of the sheet, and we listed the important stakeholders. Which one of those stakeholders influenced your viewpoint? How does their context influence your viewpoint? And how do their bioethical principles influence your viewpoint? So you're looking at specific stakeholders that support your viewpoint, but you have to discuss the context of the stakeholder so it's clear to me why that stakeholder influenced your viewpoint and what bioethical principle that stakeholder has. How did that influence your viewpoint? So you need to look at the important stakeholders and how their situation influenced your viewpoint. Now question 8. Question 8, it's just one question, but it's actually going to be probably one of your longest answers. A good critical thinker, someone who can really look at questions with an open mind, are able to describe the opposite viewpoint. Okay? So in 5, 6, and 7, actually in 4, 5, 6, and 7, the area you're going to be looking at is the tugs that pull you towards your viewpoint. So you have tugs listed, and in those questions you'll have different stakeholders, you'll have different bioethical principles, you'll have different facts that pulled you towards your viewpoint, and that's what you're going to discuss in those 3 or 4 questions. But remember, in class or online, I had you make sure that you put tugs that would pull you towards another viewpoint. In question 8, that's where you're going to discuss the opposite issue. So describe viewpoints on the issue that differ from yours. Explain the facts, the ethical principles, the stakeholders and their context in bioethical principles that support opposing viewpoints. And you may have to discuss more than one opposing viewpoint. So this is where you're going to use the tugs that are on the opposite side. So you have to discuss these tugs and how they support the opposite viewpoint that you have on this issue. And that is key. That is why I made sure that you have tugs on both sides. So that's question 8. So question 8 is going to be pretty long because it's kind of doing all these other questions up here for the opposing viewpoint. The last question is, if your viewpoint is followed, if the viewpoint that you have on this ethical issue is the one that society says, okay, we're going to go with your viewpoint, what are the implications and consequences? What are the good aspects? What good things would happen because of your viewpoint being taken? And what are the bad? There's going to be consequences to any viewpoint. So you have to discuss the good and the bad of your viewpoint if your viewpoint was the one that society chose to go with. So again, you need to think through that. If the only thing you can do is take your viewpoint and say, my viewpoint is the best viewpoint and only good things are going to happen, that's not a good critical thinker. The key is that you can look at the weaknesses. You can see the weaknesses in your viewpoint. Now, looking at the critical thinking rubric, remember we discussed I'm not really expecting you, because this rubric is designed for 4-year programs, and most of you are in your first and second year. Some of you are higher, but most of you are in your first or second year. I'm not expecting you to do well in this assignment. You don't have to get way up here on this end. I'd like to see you getting to acceptable and advanced. If you do get to excellent, I will be more than happy to give you extra points for that. So again, if you look at this, how this ties to the questions: explanation of the problem, question, conflict, or issue. This is question number 1. Okay, this is question number 1. But when you look at the rubric, you'll see that one of the things I'll be looking for is, do you explain why the question is an issue? Why is it a question that we have to look at? Okay. These next sections of the rubrics, I'll actually be using combinations of your questions. Your student position. The student position is, do you describe your viewpoint well? But do you also understand the strengths and weaknesses of your viewpoint? So part of that's going to come from looking at question 8 and describing the opposing viewpoint. Can you talk about the influence of context on your viewpoint, not just your context, but also the context of the stakeholders that you discussed and how that supports your viewpoint, and also the context of stakeholders that oppose or would go opposite of your viewpoint? Can you describe all of those? Here we have evidence. Can you give the facts and evidence that support your viewpoint as well as supporting the opposing viewpoint? And then when you get down to conclusions and related outcomes, are you able to see the good and the bad of your viewpoint as well as opposing viewpoints? So seeing the strengths and weaknesses and the consequences, the good and bad of your viewpoint as well as the opposing viewpoint. So again, I'll be looking at your answers to these questions and combining different questions to go through the rubric. We're going to do more than one of these in every class, and the reason we do that is this isn't easy. It's stretching your mind. Your brain should hurt a little bit when you finish this. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to stretch your mind. The goal of continuing education is to learn how to learn and to learn how to think. And this exercise is going to work on your ability to learn to think. And just so you don't think, well, why am I doing this? It doesn't apply to the real world. It does. While you may not deal with the specific issues we're going to go through in class, one of the things employers want to see is the ability to critically think, to think through a problem, to see both viewpoints, to pick a viewpoint but support that viewpoint, and to see the strengths and weaknesses in those viewpoints. All right, so hopefully this will help you a little bit with the assignment. We'll see how you do. Like I said, it can be a little frustrating at first. It's hard, but just because it's hard doesn't mean we don't do it. It's important, and it's an important skill that you need to learn.